first of all, I think we need to realize that the basis for most issues is change. It's change of one kind or another that gives rise to issues, simply because as long as things are rolling along the way they were, there's not really much to get upset about. There was a time, until relatively recently, when changes in that organization, in its structure, in its products or services, in its policies, could be made by the organization itself. In other words, the management or perhaps the staff, the employees could filter up an idea and we'd decide, well, we don't want that boundary line there, we'll move it there. Or we're going to double our product output or whatever we're going to do. The thinking is now that that is no longer essentially possible, that the liberty, if you will, the freedom, the time to mess around and make little changes in here because we want to make them is really an era that's past us. Instead, they talk about what they call boundary management, and that this is the boundary out here where the organization meets its publics, its customers, the society in which it operates, the government that may have some suasion over it, and that the action now occurs in a different way, that the infidels, if you will, come crashing across the boundary, and that is what forces changes in here. Now, if you'll think a minute about the role of a constituency relations person, that's where it is, right there. It's at the boundary. Constituency management is the early warning system that lets us know what the pressures are on the boundary, what people are really feeling, what changes they think ought to be occurring in here so that there aren't boundary wars. At the same time now, consider the role of the senior managers of the organization and how that's changed. They might like to do a lot of experimentation in here. They might have some great ideas. But the chances of them doing that just because they wanted to put a great idea in place are slim. Last night, what did we hear? We're not going to invest any money just because it's a good idea. We're going to invest money because of some marketing pressure out here. In other words, the boundary is enforcing what we do with our organizations. And the role of senior managers, therefore, is first and foremost to be informed. Now, all studies of American organizations indicate that the #1 problem is what we call executive isolation. Senior managers that simply are so busy with the day-to-day workflow and the paper they have to push and the meetings they have to go through that they quite unwittingly lose touch with what's happening at the boundary. They become isolated. There isn't an organization today that can exist if it thinks strictly about its own profits. The evidence of this, I think, is overwhelming. We have to think first, how do we fit in to the social environment? And so managers today have to manage for profit, yes, but they also have to manage that public policy. Once again, you can see where constituency management comes in. This is the outreach arm as well as the input arm for handling public policy. One other thing I want to say about issues themselves, and that is that I think too often we think of issues as problems. And I would urge you to switch that around and to think of issues as opportunities. When people are saying things about us, are questioning, are criticizing, they are probably showing us how to make changes now that can result in greater marketing capacity, in greater and better relationships with important constituencies. How to change policies which sooner or later down the line would cause us real problems and would really trip us up. So those folks who are saying these things to us, in fact, are not the enemy out there causing problems. They're our best friends, telling us what the opportunities are for us to keep winning that public consent that we talked about yesterday and to get those behaviors that will let us run the business in a way that is best for everyone. I think it's important to realize, however, that when people present us with opportunities, and we can see them as external opportunities, that they often are internal problems, at least for a time. Because once again, we have to make change to meet that external opportunity. Here again, a critical role can be played by constituency managers because you bring in the data that shows those folks inside who may be reluctant to make the change that it is imperative. And certainly today it's only fair that we convince our fellow managers that what we're seeing at the boundary is authentic and not just some hunch that we had. Or, gee, I talked to Tom and he's an important person and he says we ought to do this. That's no longer enough, is it? We've got to have 50 Toms in 14 different locations telling us something. So while issues are opportunities, not problems, we have to be realistic enough to know that they will cause some internal problems because they usually mean change. And so we need that wealth of information in order to be able to make those changes inside. There are 4 kinds of issues. Having said all that, painted the environmental scan, I hope. There are 4 kinds of issues. The first kind of issue is what we call a latent issue. It isn't really an issue yet, but somebody somewhere is starting to talk about it. We've picked up a few folks out in our constituency meetings that are saying this, or some scholar off at some university has written a paper on it. Those kind of people who bring up new ideas have brought it up, and if we have a very sensitive early warning system, this is where we can pick up potential issues, and this is the best place to solve them and put them to rest. Because if we don't, if we aren't attuned to these innovators out there who bring up these new issues, then they will move on and they will emerge and they will become an emerging issue. The only thing wrong with an emerging issue is that now it isn't just 1 or 2 folks who are saying it, but it's starting to truly get out there. People are hearing about it, starting to think, yeah, maybe that is an issue. If we don't put it out there, now we're in real trouble. Because today, particularly, with our instantaneous communication and with the strong emotional content of our society and with the results of the new American Revolution, in which every individual feels that he or she has the right to try and change society or companies or products in any way that they feel, we then very quickly get a hot, current issue. Frankly, I've been doing this is my 30th year, and I have to tell you, when they get there, don't even talk about issue management. It's very rarely possible. If we're going to manage them, we got to manage them up there. Of course, that isn't always possible. Sometimes they're inevitable issues, sometimes they're issues that we just aren't able to move fast enough, and they get down here to be hot issues, and then we all know what happens. We go through these periods of turmoil, and finally we come to some kind of accommodation, we settle the issue, and then we think, well, whew, we got through that one, you know, thank goodness that's over. But no, it's not. Because there's a 4th kind of issue. We call them fallout issues. Those things that weren't fully settled during the issue debate. The things that when we made the accommodation in order to get a settlement, we kind of pushed those supposedly minor points off to the side and said, well, we'll deal with those later. The trouble is they very quickly can recycle, and the worst part about fallout issues is that they don't often have to go back and become latent or emerging. They can go right back and become hot. That little scheme may not be all that useful to you, other than perhaps to show that studies of thousands of issues indicate that they don't just appear on the scene, bang, and everybody is involved. They do go through a cycle. And if we're aware of that cycle, we then can indeed manage, or start to manage, or at least manage our response to the issues. What kind of issues should we be looking for? Well, I think there are a number of kinds of issues, but let me just give you one overview of the types of issues that have caused most of the problems for organizations in the last quarter of a century or so. First is what I will call irresponsible policies. Company policies that just are not responding to what the people at the boundary feel they need, what their needs and values are. The second thing, and the one where most of the issues occur, is in the actual day-to-day operations of the company. I'm going to star that one. Some recent examples of that are, for example, the tragedy in Bhopal, India. It was clear that Union Carbide simply was not monitoring what was happening in the operations. Another place that we have to look, I think, for issues when we're out there talking to our constituents is the response strategy that the company uses on those things that are called to its attention. How do we respond when someone suggests we're not doing things exactly right, or someone suggests that we change? Response strategy is one that has caused a lot of problems. Procter & Gamble's trademark fight, you all, I guess, are familiar with that one, where some fundamentalist groups claimed that there was the sign of the devil or something in P&G's trademark. And instead of just laughing loudly and going on about their business, P&G felt they had to respond to this, and they sued the people. Well, of course, what was a relatively minor little laughable matter in 6 or 8 southern towns became national news. If I were a constituency manager, if I were one out there talking with people, this is where I would look first and foremost for issues. What in our operations are people saying? Now, we all know this. You don't need me to come here and tell you that. The problem is, what systems are now in place to monitor those operations, and then what systems are in place to catch any fallout that doesn't get monitored for quality control? In most organizations, try as we will, we don't have a very good mechanism for picking that up on the outside, except perhaps in an annual baseline study of the kinds that you do. This, I think, is an opportunity, just an outstanding opportunity in constituency management, is to watch those operational issues. The second area where you will probably be involved is in people's feelings about policies. You may run into some of these if you've got some hot issues going, and you'll pick up a few of these. But those are the areas that I think you should look for. Well, if we're going to monitor issues, if we're going to anticipate them, I guess we ought to talk about what they are, shouldn't we? Because issue is a word now that's used to cover everything. By definition, an issue is, first of all, something that affects a large number of people. It's not an issue if just a few folks are really concerned about it. It's got to have affected a large number of people. Now, that doesn't mean that in a small town, for example, the total number concerned may be 100 people. But if it's a town of 200, clearly that's a large enough percentage of the people. But if 4 folks that live on the far edge of town are upset about something, it isn't an issue yet. That's just a personal concern of theirs. If those 4 can infect 100, now it's an issue. So remember, it's got to be a shared feeling by a proportionally large number of people. The second thing is it has to have at least 2 opposing sides. There have to be at least 2 views on this issue. Now, it would be nice if that's the way it was, but usually today there are 6 views on most issues. And so it's hard to sort it out. It's hard to say those are the good guys, those are the bad guys, and they will contest on this issue. And thirdly, and most importantly, an issue has to have some emotional charge in it. It has to be something people really feel in their gut. You're going to pick up a lot of issues out there. A few of them are going to become crises. What is a crisis? A crisis is nothing more than an issue that got out of hand that was not anticipated. But the thing about crisis, when it really gets to us, and now we have missed the boat, here it is, we're in the soup, is that this can become a turning point in how publics feel about the company. Issues get people upset. Crises knock them off the walls. And then emotions run so high that we can make people angry enough, it'll take us years to get them back. In fact, often there's a sense of anxiety and dread around these crisis situations. There's an adversarial atmosphere. I mean, people are so mad at Mountain Bell that they start leaking these negative feelings out into other issues, when and how